It's week 4. I can't believe we're almost halfway through our 7 weeks together. Couple of things that I wanted to say. Over the weekend, caught up on rereading Suzanne Watson Epting's book. And one of the things that I realized was that chapter 4 has a lot of all about me. And I thought, these poor people, they're really getting too much of Fina Borgeson. And I apologize if you ever had moments when you felt that way. But I'm also pleased to be reviewing the history of the various waves of the diaconate with you. I also wondered if any of you have been using any of the additional resources. I think the first week or so, someone, can't remember who it was, mentioned one of them. But if you are, or if you've watched one of the movies, or if you found any of them useful, I guess that would be my question. Please send me an email and let me know. Or if it works, weave it into your post for the week in the forum. So here we are with the image of storyteller. At a continuing education week for deacons sometime in the 90s, I can't remember exactly when, Bill Countryman, who was then the professor of New Testament at CDSP, talked about the oral tradition and how we keep it alive. He noted that the gospel accounts, as we have them in the canon of Scripture, are really a codification of an oral tradition. The oral tradition continues, though, the orality of it continues in the sermon or homily that follows the reading of the canonical gospel text in our Eucharistic liturgies. These are the two interdependent halves of the proclamation of the gospel, each participating differently in oral storytelling. And they really shouldn't be separated by music, prayers, or other pious acts in the liturgy, but that's for another course if they ever would let me teach liturgy. So this is where we begin exploring the image of storyteller with this core story, the proclamation of the gospel. Deacon Louise Williams suggests that there are 3 ways that the role of storyteller unfolds. It begins with a story or stories. Then the storyteller develops and opens out the story in a way that hearers can find themselves in it. And then a space is made for others to tell their stories. And all 3 movements in this process of the unfolding role of storyteller, all 3 movements involve listening. We must hear the stories ourselves, the stories we are telling. This is particularly true for stories that we read repeatedly, like those pericopes from the gospel on Sundays, because listening to them as we read will help us to hear them afresh each time. So we're not just reading the gospel, we're hearing the gospel. Through listening to the story ourselves, we'll find ways to open the story to the ears of others. And of course, listening is critical as we seek and invite their stories. When I enrolled in memoir class last year, I was struck by how popular the memoir genre is. Do you know it's the most popular form of nonfiction books today? I could go on and on about why I think this is, but a key reason seems to be that people want to experience authentic voices. They want to know who is telling this story. There's also the making of many books about how to write a memoir. We are told in some of these that the first question to ask oneself when writing is, why this story? Why this particular story? And the second thing to ponder and to be clear about when telling or writing a story is who is telling this story? I think that that's generally good advice for storytelling, because I wonder if you've ever heard a sermon or a speaker where you wanted to stand up and shout, "Enough about you." I know that I have, but of course, being polite, we would never do that. At the same time, we've all heard stories where we long to know Who is telling this story? Who is delivering this message? When we are the storyteller, it is important to seek a balance, to seek a Goldilocks point, if you will, a just right point between making it all about us and, on the other hand, neglecting to reveal something about ourselves. The work of Marshall Ganz on public narrative, this was being touted in Episcopal circles a decade or so ago, suggests that effective stories in community ministry include three movements: the story of me, the story of us, and the story of now. In other words, who is telling this story? Why is it important to us, to our community? And why is it timely, perhaps with some action steps that need to be or could be engaged immediately? I find the stories of Let Science Speak, and if you, there's a couple places on this week's posts where you will find a link, the URL for Let Science Speak. But I find their stories to be particularly good examples of addressing an issue in ways that balance to getting to know who is telling the story, what motivates their work, and presenting information in a way that motivates others. And I posted one that I found particularly effective here. It's Dr. Marshall Shepard, who has a doctorate in meteorology, but also is I think, CNN meteorologist, or the Weather Channel. That's it, the Weather Channel. I don't know. I don't have a TV, but I just found his story just a really good brief. It's a video. It's 4 or 5 minutes. A really good example of the kind of story that balances who am I and why am I particularly suited and motivated to tell this story, and getting some points across that might really be motivating to other people. Finally, I want to suggest 3 things that we need to focus on as we make space for and listen to the stories in our community. And the weekly activity is about stories in community. We need to listen for stories that are rich, compelling, and evocative. There are many stories in our communities, but as we engage diaconally, we need to have a nose for stories that express well the hopes and needs and concerns in our communities. So that's step 1, point 1. Secondly, finding those stories. When we've found them, we need to listen to them, really listen. And I think the third thing I would say is, and I mentioned this as a response to somebody's post this last week. When we listen, we need to listen beneath the listening. We need to listen for the stories that underlie the stories that we're being told. It may be a historical bit or a cultural story or just a pattern of stories that we're hearing in our communities. So often the first stories that we hear when we're exploring an issue area or meeting a new group of people are not the most important or significant stories. So we need to go on listening and listen deeply, because listening deeply can lead us to the stories that matter the most and are the most compelling. I wanted to just mention with the assignment, which is about identifying commonly held community stories and also places where those stories are told. And do I need to say that when I say community, I do not mean the gathered church community? Okay, just making sure of that. Okay, but because I think we've had a lot in our North American culture, a loss of commonly held stories in our communities. We've had a loss of stories that are known and transmitted in community in our time. And I think some of this has to do with the loss of community. You can't have community stories without a community feeling and people's engagement with one another. Sometimes I think consumerism, which so dominates our society, contributes to the erosion of community and the loss of community stories. Um, I've been reading this book, Another Kingdom, Departing the Consumer Culture, um, written by three mature white, my tongue is in my cheek, um, white men, but all prominent in their fields. Peter Block, a management consultant who's turned those skills into community redevelopment. Walter Brueggemann, a retired professor of Old Testament or Hebrew scripture from a Christian perspective. And John McKnight, one of the founders of asset-based community development. And I'm assuming you folks in Chicago, the Chicago area, know about that, since Northwestern was kind of the university was the hotbed. Anyway, in this book, there is a three-word punchline, which is this. It says, commodity replaces narrative. And I've been pondering that since I read it last week. That whole idea of a dominantly consumer culture and what it does to destroy our commonly held stories. Anyway, that's what I have to say this week. And I hope that you'll enjoy the reading this week. I hope you'll take a look at the additional resources because, a couple of them are short videos. There's a movie too. That'll be a surprise if you want to look at that. And have fun. Have fun with the forum activity. So see you next week.